The most performed exercise in every gym in the world is also the one executed incorrectly by the largest proportion of people performing it. And the errors are not minor. They are structural, they are consistent, and they are quietly limiting results while building injury risk that compounds with every session. If this is your first time here, subscribe and share this with someone who squats regularly and has never had the specific mechanics of the movement broken down to this level of detail. This channel exists to give people the technical understanding that most fitness content assumes they already have, and almost nobody does. The squat is the foundational movement of human physical capability. Sitting down and standing up is a squat. Picking something up from a low position is a squat variant. The capacity to lower and raise the body under control against gravity is one of the most fundamental expressions of physical function that exists, and it is the movement most directly associated with lower body strength, athletic capacity, and the structural resilience of the hip, knee, and spine complex across a lifetime. It is also the movement most consistently performed in ways that reduce its effectiveness, misdirect its loading, and create the cumulative stress on joints and connective tissue that eventually presents as the knee pain, lower back strain, and hip discomfort that countless regular trainers accept as an unavoidable cost of squatting heavy. It is not unavoidable. It is the predictable outcome of specific mechanical errors so normalized by repetition and imitation that they have become what most people believe correct squatting looks like. Identifying and correcting them does not just make the squat safer. It fundamentally changes which muscles are being loaded, how much force the spine and knees are managing, and what the movement is actually capable of producing in terms of strength and muscle development. The knee cave and what is actually causing it. The first and most visible squat error is the one most people have been told to correct without ever being told why it happens or what is actually driving it. The knees collapsing inward during the descent or ascent of a squat, a movement called knee valgus, is almost universally cued with the instruction to push the knees out. That cue addresses the symptom. It does not address the cause. And without addressing the cause, the correction is effortful, inconsistent, and temporary, dependent on conscious override rather than resolved through the structural change that eliminates the problem. Knee valgus during a squat is primarily a hip abductor and external rotator weakness issue, not a knee issue. The gluteus medius and the deep external rotators of the hip, the muscles responsible for maintaining the femur in proper alignment as the hip flexes under load, are insufficient to resist the internal rotation forces generated by the movement. The knee collapses inward not because something is wrong at the knee, but because the hip cannot maintain the lateral stability required to keep the femur tracking correctly over the foot. Cueing someone to push their knees out forces a conscious override of a weakness that the movement is exposing. It produces the appearance of correct alignment without building the hip stability that would produce it automatically. The moment the cognitive load of the session increases, when the weight gets heavy, when fatigue accumulates, when attention moves to managing the load, the valgus returns because the underlying capacity was never developed. The actual fix is targeted hip abductor and external rotator activation work before squatting. Banded clamshells, lateral band walks, single-leg glute bridges, combined with a deliberate reduction in load to the point where the hip can actually maintain correct femoral alignment throughout the movement under genuine muscular control. Building the capacity before demanding the performance is the correction that does not disappear when the weight increases. The lower back, rounding that most people cannot feel. The second structural error in the squat is the one with the most significant potential for long-term harm, and the most insidious because it often occurs in a range the person performing the movement cannot see, cannot feel clearly, and has not been given the conceptual framework to self-monitor. Lumbar flexion under load, the lower back rounding that occurs when the pelvis posteriorly tilts at the bottom of the squat, is commonly called a butt wink in training circles. The term is casual enough that it has obscured the severity of what is happening mechanically. When the lumbar spine flexes under a loaded barbell or during a heavy bodyweight squat, the compressive and shear forces on the intervertebral discs increase significantly. The discs, the cartilaginous cushions between the vertebral bodies that distribute spinal loading, are most vulnerable to injury in a flexed position under load because the posterior annulus, the outer ring of the disc, experiences elevated tensile stress in this configuration. A single session of lumbar flexion under load does not produce disc injury in most people. A year of squatting with consistent lumbar flexion under progressively heavier loads produces cumulative stress on disc tissue that manifests eventually as the lower back pain that most people attribute to the squat itself, rather than to the specific mechanical error occurring within it. The cause of this error is typically one of three things: inadequate ankle dorsiflexion, mobility limiting how far the tibia can travel forward over the foot, causing the pelvis to compensate by tucking under, insufficient hip mobility preventing the hip from achieving the required depth without pelvic compensation, or squatting to a depth that exceeds current mobility, requiring pelvic tilt to reach. Each cause has a different corrective approach. Ankle mobility limitations respond to targeted calf and Achilles stretching and elevated heel positioning during squats while mobility develops. Hip mobility limitations respond to hip flexor and hip capsule work. Depth limitations respond to reducing depth to the range where the lumbar spine can remain neutral, building mobility and positional strength progressively. Rather than squatting to a depth the body is not yet structurally prepared to achieve safely under load. The missing tension that changes everything. Here is the squat error that is least discussed and most transformative to correct, because it is not a visible movement fault. It is an absence. The absence of full body tension before and throughout the movement. Most people who squat treat the movement as an exercise for the legs. They focus on the lower body mechanics, the knee tracking, the depth, the foot position, and allow the upper body and core to remain relatively passive passengers. The bar sits on the back. The torso goes along for the ride. And the spine, the rib cage, and the trunk musculature manage the load without the deliberate engagement that would make that management structurally sound. Before descending into any squat, the entire body should be braced as a unified system. This begins with the breath. A deep diaphragmatic breath taken before the descent, followed by a bracing of the abdominal wall outward in all directions, not sucking in but expanding, creates intra-abdominal pressure that functions as an internal brace for the lumbar spine. This mechanism, called the Valsalva maneuver when taken to its full application, significantly increases the spinal stability available during the movement and reduces the compressive demand on the vertebral structures by distributing it across the pressurized trunk cavity. Simultaneously, the lats, the large muscles of the mid and upper back, should be actively engaged before the descent begins. Cueing them by trying to break the barbell or bend it around the body produces a lat engagement that stabilizes the thoracic spine, creates a muscular shelf that improves bar position, and prevents the forward torso collapse that characterizes the squat of someone relying on passive structure rather than active muscular support to manage the load. Upper back engagement, core bracing, and pressurization before the descent begins transforms the squat from a lower body exercise with a bar on it into a total body strength expression where every muscular structure is contributing to the integrity of the movement. The difference in what the legs can express, how much force the quads, glutes, and hamstrings can generate against the floor, when the foundation they are working against is a rigid, braced trunk versus a passive one, is substantial and immediately noticeable. The foot position and descent pattern. Nobody standardizes correctly. The final layer of the squat error is the one that most coaching cues oversimplify in a way that creates new problems while attempting to solve existing ones. Foot width, toe angle, and the path of the descent vary across individuals based on hip anatomy, specifically the depth and angle of the hip socket and the angle at which the femoral neck meets the femoral shaft. These are structural variables that differ between people in ways that mean a single universal foot position is mechanically appropriate for some individuals and mechanically compromising for others. The person with deep hip sockets and minimal femoral anteversion, a forward twist in the femur, will squat comfortably with feet relatively close together and toes pointing moderately outward. The person with shallow hip sockets or significant femoral anteversion will require a wider stance and greater toe-out angle to achieve depth without the femur contacting the hip socket rim and causing the pelvis to tuck under. The cue to squat with feet shoulder-width apart and toes at 30 degrees is a reasonable starting point for many people and an inappropriate prescription for many others. The correct foot position for any individual is the one that allows the hip to move freely into depth without pelvic compensation, the knee to track over the toes without medial or lateral deviation, and the torso to remain upright enough to distribute loading across the entire kinetic chain rather than concentrating it at the lower back. Finding that position requires experimentation, trying variations in stance width and toe angle with attention to where the hip feels free versus restricted at depth, where the lumbar spine maintains its neutral position, and where the knee tracking feels mechanically clean. That individual optimal position, once identified, is the one worth developing and loading progressively, not the universal prescription that happens to work for the person who wrote it. Conclusion: the squat is not a dangerous exercise. It is not the cause of the knee pain, lower back strain, and hip discomfort that so many regular practitioners experience. Those outcomes are the product of specific, correctable mechanical errors that have been performed so consistently and for so long that they have become the unconscious standard for what squatting looks like in most training environments. Correcting hip abductor weakness rather than cueing around knee valgus. Addressing ankle and hip mobility to eliminate lumbar flexion rather than squatting to a depth the body cannot manage safely. Creating genuine full-body tension before the descent rather than relying on passive structural support. Finding individual foot position based on personal hip anatomy rather than universal prescription. These corrections do not make the squat easier. They make it real, a genuine expression of lower body strength and total body mechanical integrity that produces the muscle development, strength capacity, and structural resilience the movement is capable of delivering when it is performed with the precision it deserves. Squat with that precision every session, and understand that the investment in correct mechanics now is the investment in the joints, the spine, and the physical capability that will still be functioning well decades from now. If this changed how you understand a movement you have been performing for months or years, subscribe and share this with a training partner who squats. Every video on this channel is built around the level of technical depth that actually changes outcomes, not surface-level cues that leave the real problems in place. Most people squatting regularly are developing the movement patterns, joint stresses, and muscular imbalances that will eventually end their ability to squat, not because the exercise is harmful, but because the specific errors embedded in how they perform it have never been identified precisely enough to correct.